Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 11th of April and it's my first video in nearly 2 weeks, so I do apologize for that. I was extremely busy, haven't been this busy in a while, but it happens, and now I'm going to focus on videos again for the next couple of weeks, so I'm looking forward to that. But the truth is I haven't really been keeping track of all the changes during this time period, and so I spent just the past like 3 hours going over the changes from the past 2 weeks, getting them in my head. And so now, of course, I'm going to share all of that information with you guys. And so it is going to be a bit of a summary of the recent advances that have occurred starting around 30th, 31st of March. And we're going to try to connect it together in a way that is digestible and also look at the timeline for all of that. And so we're going to work our way from the south and go to the northeast. So starting off just to the northwest of Verbove, there were some minor changes that started around the 26th of March actually. That's when we saw a gradual increase in the intensity of the Russian attacks that were occurring just to the northwest of the Siversk line in areas that had taken over those Russian VDV regiments over the past couple of months. And so we saw the manifestation of that Russian pressure unfolding with their capture of additional territories that I'm going over with this red perimeter, which I'm going to be using a lot of in this video. This red perimeter generally encapsulates the area the Russians were able to capture first from the 26th to the 31st of March, and then in additional probes and additional attacks that occurred in the early days of April. And so you can see that it was an advance of a couple hundred meters westwards, but that's really all we're going to do in terms of looking at the specifics, just because there's so much to look at. I can't really do any one front its full justice, so I'm going to go over all of them, and then from now on, of course, focus on all of them and analyze them in a proper manner. Now, looking at Novomykhailivka, you could see that there are some changes from 2 weeks ago. So first of all, the Russian forces have entered the Mashino Troitel district. That's the northwestern dacha area of the village, one of the last remaining strongholds the Ukrainians had under their control here. And so the Russians, really starting by the end of March, but then going into early April, they started launching armored assaults across the fields over here. Even I was talking about them before I went on my hiatus. And the Russian forces overrun the Ukrainian defenses in this region. And that's really because the Russians weren't just attacking in one part of Novomykhailivka. They were putting increased and incessant pressure all across the line of contact in a way that the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade could not handle effectively every single time. And so the line cracked in this particular area. The Russian forces were able to enter the district. Now it's been over a week since then, and they're clearing out those dachas. Another area where they advanced was in the center of Novomykhailivka. They advanced along the main roads from where they were previously organized at in the center around those like post offices and schools. So it's an advance of 600, 700 meters westwards for the Russian forces, with the Ukrainians still positioned in some of these residential buildings or residential areas in the west. At the same time, also about a week ago, because the bulk of the Russian advances in Novomykhailivka occurred now over a week ago, you had Russian increased pressure on Novomykhailivka's southern flank, and this makes a lot of sense when you look at the topography. If you look at the vector of the Russian attack, first of all, you can see that it's directed towards this particular trench that the Ukrainians set up in order to protect this particular height. And so the Russian forces, if we have a marker of it over here, on March 31st, they launched their first assaults towards this yellow trench. They were, of course, repelled by the 79th Air Assault Brigade on the first attempt, but then going into April 4th, by then the Russians had full control over this field area and over the Ukrainian defensive system. And so despite the Ukrainian resistance, the Russians were able to get control over these key positions. And they really are important, this area that I'll mark with these two red arrows, because this area that the Russians are now solidifying control over will give them the opportunity to overlook all of the Ukrainian defensive positions and logistical hubs, basically routes that are going from the line of contact to Krasnohorivka or even further westwards. Or if we look south from the road that starts in Vuhledar, which you can't see on the map, but Vuhledar is sort of like protruding over here in the bottom left corner and then makes its way to Krasnohorivka. And so these Russian height positions will give them a forward vantage point to look at and attack the Ukrainian, basically entire defensive node in southern Donetsk. So that's a positive for the Russian side. And then also to the north of Novomykhailivka, over the past few days, the Russians have established control over additional fields that I was talking about how the Russians would try to take them over in the hopes that they could then use them to finish off the Battle of Novomykhailivka. It turns out in the end the Russian forces have sort of utilized every single attack vector to their advantage. They've attacked directly through the village, they've attacked along the flanks, and really they have been forced to attack through the village because the Ukrainians did mount a successful defensive campaign on both the southern and northern flanks for half a year. And so eventually the Russians just decided to go in, and really that does yield higher casualties for all sides. But you can see the result is the Ukrainians are now only in control of 30% of the village, and that number continues to dwindle as the Ukrainians withdraw to Pervomaiske, for instance, and then the Russians have their eyes set on the basically this junction of roads that is Krasnohorivka to the west. Now looking at the village of Krasnohorivka, which is the last remaining Ukrainian village that was set up in preparation for defenses against a potential Russian invasion back in 2014 along the ceasefire line, oil skis of the Russian forces. Now it's been over a month since then. They tried to establish positions in the southern outskirts. They were pushed out completely, and I should edit the map to show that the Ukrainians have full control over this district. And that's something I talked about even before my hiatus. But since then, the Russian forces regrouped in this region and they opened up a new attack vector. They expected that the attack vector from the south would be more beneficial because you could see the Ukrainian defenses here appear to be at least less fortified. But now they've decided to take this route along the rail line. This offers some more protection in the form of trenches and then concealment along those different bushes, you could say. And so there was a Russian advance recorded starting on April 6th. That's when the Russian preparation started. By the 9th of April, the Russian forces, in tandem with rather large armored assaults, these are like substantial numbers of armored vehicles advancing in a tightly packed formation. You could say 7, 8, 9 vehicles at once advancing along this particular route and making their way into the entrance to Krasnohorivka in the southeastern sections, dismounting infantry. And of course, it's met by Ukrainian resistance, but the geolocated footage does indicate that the Russian forces do have a presence near the cemetery area and near some of the first houses and the approaches to the city itself. And so the Russians, they have now found an area where they could actually break through the Ukrainian defensive lines that are marked in yellow. And that's now going to be the basis, the building block for any further Russian attacks that are going to try to get full control over this defensive hub. Now moving on to Pervomaiske, we can see that this section of the front had the most significant changes this month. And the very interesting thing is, I used to view the sector around Pervomaiske and Novelske as its own separate theater, you could say, in comparison to the Russian activities that occurred further north along the Terny River to the west of Avdiivka. But now with the recent Russian advances, you could see how those different theaters have now combined, and you could see how in the broader scale, the broader image of the situation for the Ukrainians, how the Russian theaters are actually working in tandem towards a common goal of approaching the Avdiivka River located over here. And now the Russians will be more unified in doing so due to these recent gains that have occurred connecting those two parts of the front. And so looking at the timeline for all this, before I went on my hiatus, you could say that the Russians were in control of like 70-80% of Pervomaiske, and that was at the end of March. And so really during that time period, the Russians put sustained pressure directly through Pervomaiske to push out the Ukrainians that were still holding out in the northwestern outskirts of the village, which would be, around here. And there was also pressure coming in directly from the east from Vodiane, which was still not under full Russian control. But then we got this video, which is from April 1st, actually, of the DPR's 9th Marine Brigade, one of the key units involved in the battles over here in recent weeks. They raised the Russian flag in Vodiane, and that was the verification of full Russian control over that village, and the fact that the Russians were advancing along this eastern flank and squeezing out the Ukrainians in turn that may have been positioned along these positions over here. And so, really, by April 9th, it was fully verified that the Ukrainians retreated from Pervomaiske, that the 9th Brigade had full control over the locality. But really, in the week preceding that, it was really just combing operations, clearing out the remaining houses that are, in a way, just connected to Netelove. And you could see how the Russian advance sort of seamlessly transitions now towards Netelove, as Netelove is on similar elevation to Pervomaiske, rather low elevation. It's on the same road, the E50 road, and you're attacking it from the same directions. And so now Netelove has just become an extension of Pervomaiske in that regard, with the Ukrainians building up their new defenses within the village and also on the southern and northern outskirts of it. And so, really looking at the early days of April, the Russians took advantage of their new gains and started pushing northwards. So we have some videos of that I applied to the map, and I can't add all of them because there were simply so many. But there's just one here of like a Russian armored advance past Pervomaiske, and that's in the fields to the north of it. And these fields are a pretty interesting area because if you look back at the history from like a couple of weeks ago, this field area, this open field area that you could say is in between Umanske and Pervomaiske, it was largely under Ukrainian control, or at the very least a gray zone. And I'll try to mark it for you guys in blue in case you don't remember. But like this entire area was previously imagined to be under Ukrainian control. And I talked about the potential scenarios at the time with the Russians trying to push directly through this Ukrainian line and secure the trenches and the hills that are located at the center of this field complex. And in a way, that's what actually ended up happening. Because if we look at the situation to the west of Tonenke, the Russian forces, they utilized the village as this organizing hub for all of their vehicles. And they launched rather large armored assaults along these paths, and we have a lot of recordings from them. Some of these recordings come from the 3rd Assault Brigade, and in particular the Lumiere drone group. Others come from the 25th Airborne Brigade, I believe they're called. Over here you have them. And so they're also involved a lot in the fighting now. We're defending for the Ukrainians. So in a way, here we have this video. You can see it's from the 25th Air Brigade. Their FPVs. They hit various Russian vehicles. They hit dismounted Russian infantry, whether in fields or trenches, walking on routes. And all of that gives an idea as to where the Russians are putting pressure and advancing. And so this video is actually from April 2nd, so it's already like 10 days ago now. And you could see how the Russian forces were able to reach the outskirts of Umanske even back then. And if we look at the distances, it's only about like, 700, 800 meters from the heart of Umanske itself. The only thing separating the Russian infantry and vehicles from this Ukrainian defensive hub is the Terny River in this case. And so the Terny River is acting as a natural barrier, but you could see how really in early April the Russian forces took advantage of this weak point in the Ukrainian line, because again, the Ukrainians are so focused, or were at least so focused, on first counterattacking once they lost Avdiivka. Then they utilized those same reinforcements to, at the very least, hold the line in an area like Orlivka, Tonenke, Berdichi, Semenivka. And then to add on top of that, the Ukrainians had to defend against attacks on Pervomaiske and further south on Krasnohorivka. And so there perhaps was less of a focus on building up a strong defensive core in these fields to the west of Tonenke, especially once the Ukrainian garrison within Tonenke was pushed out and was treated. They didn't have the wherewithal to continue holding on to positions that are very exposed, that are not well prepared directly to the west of it. And so those are just some of the explanations for why the Russians would take advantage of the situation and send a rather large number of vehicles across. Of course, many of them get damaged, but the point at the end of the day is that the Russians were able to advance at most, if we're measuring from Terny, 3-4 kilometers westwards. At this point, they control a large section of this Ukrainian trench line that was built over here. And all in all, they're getting control over the local hills in this region, because the local hills are located in this red rectangle, while the valleys are basically surrounding it in all the positions that are adjacent to the river, the river reservoirs, and local roads. So this entire region over here, and the Russians, by virtue of their advances, now have this perfect position to overlook all those areas and then branch out and attack individually those specific targets. And as a result of the Russian attack vector that was coming to the west of Tonenke, and at the same time the dual pressure coming from the north, you still had some Ukrainian infantry squads, whether they be from the 53rd Brigade or 59th Brigade, whatever unit we're looking at. They were located in between. They were sort of smack in the middle, and they were in a very precarious situation, didn't want to be enveloped, and so they also ended up withdrawing to a more unified line, which you could say is now running from Umanske to Netalove, and then a bit to the west in Avdiivka. And so that area does have some trenches that are now being built up, and that's another longer, it's another Russian target because it is on the Vovcha River. In the Vovcha River, the Russians are now pretty close to it in this particular field, and also just because from there they would be able to separate the Ukrainian defensive force that is defending to the west of Avdiivka and the one that is defending Netalove. By reaching the Vovcha River, it would make the avenues for the Ukrainians of resupply and communication coordination a bit longer, and the Russians are trying to undermine that cohesiveness. So really the bottom line is the Russians were able to close this basically this bulge that was formed over here by the Ukrainians. They were able to close that, advance towards the Talove, which is still under full Ukrainian control, advance towards the Vovcha River to the west, advance relatively quickly towards Umansk, securing all the fields to the south of it, which means that now the Russians are clearing out all of the positions that are to the south or to the east of the Terny River in preparations for finding a weak point through which they could cross it. And they're also very close to this trench line that was built by the Ukrainians just to the north of the Terny River, which is acting as really protective for the southern flank, protection for the southern flank to prevent the Russians from attacking from the south and cutting off any sort of Ukrainian defenses that are located on the heights that are just to the west of Siversk along these blue X's. And speaking of Siversk, we do have some geolocated footage from earlier in April. 1st of April here, Lemir drone group FPVs, they struck Russian infantry that were able to enter southern Siversk. And then from a couple days later, we have, again, this compilation of the Ukrainian drone crews dropping grenades onto a lot of Russian vehicles that are in the fields to the east of the Terny River, but then some actually Russian infantry making their way into the southernmost houses. So they were also struck, of course. And that's a verification that, first of all, the Ukrainians are defending in this region, but also that the Russians were able to gain a foothold in the village. And that, again, the main Ukrainian defensive component along the Terny River is not actually Siversk, but the defenses that are built just to the west of it. So that could be this yellow defense over here, this yellow one over here, or some other heights that are located a bit further to the west, several hundred meters to the west of it. And so now the Russians, they found an area, a crossing of the Terny River that is relatively easy along this route over here, and then a bit to the south. You can see how the river like dries up a bit. It's a very narrow portion to cross over, and so it is relatively easy. And so the Russians have been doing that consistently now for over a week, but there is still no information about the full capture of Siversk. I saw some information about additional territory in Siversk being captured, but I can't verify that. I'm just going based off of the geolocated data. And then in Berdichi, Again, very interesting situation because when I went on my hiatus, there was a lot of information originally, like early May or early April, that the Russians were able to cross over the Terny River and that they were putting pressure on the northern outskirts of Semenivka, basically along this attack vector. So far, there's still not any evidence that the Russians have been able to solidify control past the river. There have been, I believe, now 2 incidents where the Russians, in pretty interesting numbers, like several vehicles actually being able to cross over the river, over the road connecting across the Terny, and they were attacked by the Ukrainians, but there's no really conclusive indication that they were able to solidify control over there and then expand further westwards of the Russians. But at the same time, over this past week, but in particular in recent days, like 9th, 10th, 11th of April, the Russians have been working really hard to clear out the eastern sections of Berdichi. So when I went on my hiatus, the map looked, I believe, something like this. And in time since then, the Russian forces have cleared out all of these various tree lines, forested areas where the Ukrainians were entrenched, trying to prevent the Russians from advancing westwards. The Russians cleared out these two parallel roads. They cleared out the extension of that road until the Terny River, and so now most of Berdichi is under Russian control, and that gives the Russians a stepping stone to now cross over the Terny River, establish positions in local heights along this field over here, and then flank from the north and put pressure on Simenivka, or what's left of it. Another interesting piece of information is that recently the Russians restarted attacks on Novomykhailivka. This is a very interesting area to attack. If you look at it, the Russians are attacking from a position where they have the high ground. If we look at the rail lines, all that area just to the north of Krasnohorivka is on the local heights that are overlooking an area, for instance, like Novomykhailivka. And so the Russians are taking advantage of that and advancing in the fields to the east of that village. And there's a video of Ukrainians shelling Russians when they took up positions in some of the warehouses on the approaches to that village. And so there's also another video of Russian vehicles and infantry advancing through that same field on April 8th, again laying the framework, the groundwork for a future Russian attack from the eastern flank towards this particular village. And it's all part of the broader plan of getting control of certain territory east of Ocheretine. So then that village could eventually be taken over by the Russians, because Ocheretine is one of the largest Ukrainian coordination hubs right now. You can see it's like a junction of roads. It's also the highest elevated area for the Ukrainians in the entire region, and so they are trying to hold on to it. And by opening up new attack vectors, it does split up the Ukrainian forces, catch them by surprise, and further attrit their forces. Now, looking at the Chasiv Yar front, which is now what I'm going to be referring to it, because the Russian forces are on the outskirts of the city itself. We'll start off with Avdiivka. I know a lot of Russian sources for a while now, over a week, maybe more, have been claiming that Avdiivka is under their full control. I haven't seen any indication that this section of the village has come under Russian control, despite everything that's occurred around the village, despite the fact that in the eastern sections of the village, there is proof based on Ukrainian admissions that the Russians got control over key warehouses, key trenches. All of that is true. So the Russians did definitely advance several hundred meters southwards in this direction, if we measure it, actually over a kilometer. And at the same time, they advanced to the west of Avdiivka, but we don't know about this particular section. In all likelihood, it is still a gray zone. At the same time, over the past week and a half, the Russians put a lot of effort into securing Mount Baba. That's the name of a local height that the Russians have understood plays a key role in unlocking additional areas that they can take over, additional sections of the front line that would then basically pave the way for them to reach the Donbass Canal line, which is actually located on some rather high elevation on a ridge. And so a lot of the Russian advances were occurring to the north of Avdiivka along this attack vector. And then you had this one incident, which I have marked on my map actually, which shows a Ukrainian response to Russian vehicles that were advancing along the T-0504 road. I don't know if they were attacking southwards or westwards, but you could see this was the work of Ukrainian FPV drone crews. And on April 1st, they succeeded in destroying at least 5 Russian vehicles in that particular incident. And so, in the time since then, the Russian forces have secured a large amount of Ukrainian trenches. You can see them all marked in yellow on the map. A lot of fortifications that were hastily built up, some that were built up earlier within the forests, within tree lines. And you can see how this particular forest is now being taken over. The Russian forces now a vector to directly reach the Donbass Canal in an area of it that is actually open, that is not located in water. So this is just like a completely open area that does have the concealment of forests. So there's no body of water in that particular region. They're just the pipes that are connecting the water together. And this Russian advance around Mount Baba also gives the Russians this key position to the south of the Canal District as they make preparations for actually storming that part of Chasiv Yar. And that's really the big news out of the sector. The fact that gradually the Russians have been able to first send infantry into trenches located on the outskirts of the Canal District, which is, if you don't know, over here. They did that even when I was making videos still around this section over here, this red perimeter. And then day by day, they began knocking the Ukrainians out of additional positions that, I'm going over with my cursor in red. That made its way into early April. And then you had the Russians actually entering into the forested areas to the northeast of the Canal District and doing so with the support of BMPs, MTLBs, various armored vehicles that paved the way in large numbers, sometimes even along this main route over here, and then dismounted infantry. And so there was one particularly interesting video which shows the response of the 67th Mechanized Brigade to a large Russian armored assault, which did not actually try, I believe, to take over the district. I think the point of that was to try to secure the perimeter. And in that regard, it was successful. This is from April 4th. They succeeded in gaining the first foothold into the Canal micro-district. It secured various forested patches, various trenches. And so now the Russians actually have a foothold within this Ukrainian defensive node. The Russians trying to poke holes in it immediately, not to give the Ukrainians time to build it up. But even then, the Russians will definitely try to increase shelling or increase their production of fabs and launch those bombs onto the various Ukrainian strongholds in the Canal micro-district and more generally in Chasiv Yar, because this entire area is filled with just massive apartment buildings that the Ukrainians have set up as firing points and observation posts towards approaching Russians. And of course, there's various factories and other sort of like concrete reinforced facilities. And it is, of course, interesting to see the 67th Mechanized Brigade involved in the defense over here, because this unit was involved in defending northern Luhansk for a very long time, around Avdiivka, you could say. And now at least some of their elements have been moved to the more pressing part of the front line to hold out once the Russians actually reach the Canal micro-district. At the same time, the Russians have got, you could say, 95% control over Avdiivka. The process was, in essence, the Russians advancing through the fields directly to the south of Avdiivka. Those are also the key heights that overlook the valley on which Avdiivka is located. And so first those are secured, and then over the course of the past week, the Russians have been advancing further southwards in an effort to flank the Canal micro-district from the north. And so, by virtue of doing so, the Russians also passed through Avdiivka itself, going through the houses, the main road, and the Ukrainians in turn were pushed out of most of it. There are still some Ukrainian holdouts in some warehouses to the east of Kalinina, but for the most part, the Russians have secured this settlement. We could see the Ukrainian response once the Russians advanced on April 8th, which shows Ukrainian FPV crews and cluster munitions being utilized to target Russian soldiers that were, combing through the houses or any sort of vehicles that the Russians were using to advance from Avdiivka further southwards. And so you can see how the battlefield is shaping up in a way where the Russian forces want to envelop the Kaliningrad district. They want to take it out methodically, and they, want to use that as a springboard to then cross over the canal and attack Chasiv Yar. But I will talk about that in extreme detail in future videos, so keep your eyes out for that. Further north, around Vesele, Avdiivka, this entire area, southern Siversk front, we did see Russian advances that were verified by geolocation on April 4th. This is from the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade, a LPR affiliated unit. They advanced with their BMPs from Vesele, which was captured like 2 months ago now. Infantry dismounted and they stormed the Ukrainian trenches that are probably composed of territorial defense units, not the best formations, and again, not the best defenses, but whatever they had. You could see how it was forming a unified line with the small yellow patches. And so the Russian goal is to, undermine the defense line, and they did so from the furthest east point, and they were able to secure that section of the trench. And then a bit to the east, we saw a larger Russian advance by the 123rd. It was an advance that was aided, of course, by the Russian armored vehicles advancing either through these paved routes over here or along this rail line. And so they made a push. They overran the Ukrainian dugouts and trenches in the south of Avdiivka. And so you can see how gradually the Russians are trying to expand their zone of control in an effort to eventually reach the Ukrainian defenses around Avdiivka and the even larger defenses that were set up near Avdiivka, where there is a pretty large fortress. And so the Russians, at a very slow pace because it's not a priority part of the front line, but whenever they do attack, they are trying to gradually chip away at the Ukrainian presence that has been built up using a lot of these trenches and bush areas, such as the tree lines. At the same time, there is confirmation that the Ukrainians are in full control of Spirny. This is based on videos from late March showing Russian shelling of the gas compressor station in Spirny, which would indicate that the Ukrainians actually have control over this entire blue perimeter. I just can't change the map to indicate that based on some faulty error with my map, but you get the idea. And then the last thing we'll talk about is the fact that when I left in the first few days, there was information about the Russians advancing towards Terny, potential entrance to Terny. None of that ended out being true in reality. In truth, over the past week, the Ukrainians, they have understood that the Russians did put an unusual amount of pressure on the Terny onto the Zherebets River line, and the Russians were getting very, very close. You could say like a kilometer away from the locality itself, for 2 kilometers. And so the Ukrainians, they organized their squads in the region and launched a rather small localized counterattack. Retook several hundred meters of land, which could be shown over here, and they include 1 kilometer span of fields and large forested patches. And so those are the areas being fought over, but again, a less critical part of the front line for the Russian side. And that is all for today. Tomorrow I will be out with a new video, and we're going to just go right back into discussing the minutiae. We're going to look at the analysis topographic map, fortification map. We'll look at the recent energy infrastructure strikes, all of that. But I had to do this video, so thank you all for understanding and watching. So thank you guys, and goodbye.